Here at GMBN Tech, we get a lot of questions about the effects of ill bike setup and basically how that affects you when you're riding out on the trail. Things I'm talking about are stuff like numb hands, not being able to keep the front wheel down when you're climbing, maybe struggling to lift the front wheel to do a manual, or even just saddle pain. So we thought we'd take a look through bike setup and we'll see how that affects both your riding comfort and how you can actually ride out on the trails. Okay, so the first one on that list is your handlebar grips. They're your direct point of contact from your hand to the handlebar of the bike. Now, there are lots of different handlebar grips available and it's a very personal preference thing. The grip that I might like may not be the right grip for you, so you have to bear this in mind. There are lots of different geometries of rubber. You can have some that are firm rubber, some that are very soft rubber, some with lots of padding, some with barely any padding. You get fat grips, you get thin grips, you get profiled grips to give more support to your hand. It's really important to experiment and try and find the right handlebar grip for yourself. But one of the first things you want to take into account is where the pain is that you're getting. If it's just discomfort, you're going to be able to put this down to your grips, I'm sure. You're going to be able to figure it out. These particular grips from Ergon are actually fatter on the outside than they are on the inside. So it actually gives the outside of your hand a bit more support. And the inside of your hand, it gives it a bit more room, a bit more control on the handlebars. They also come in a couple of different diameter sizes. I personally like the thinner one, even though I've got quite big hands. It might be the complete opposite with you. I actually find a lot of people do like a bigger grip because it transmits less shock through to your hand, but I really like being able to feel the trail, feel what the bike is doing underneath me, and for that, that's why I choose thin grips. If you're getting pain on the outside of your hand, that's because the area is the ulnar nerve. There's a lot of reasons this can be happening, but this is a nerve system that runs basically up the whole outside of your arm, and it becomes a pressure point. So there's a lot of different factors within that that can also add to it. But just bear in mind with the grip pattern, there's a lot out there that could suit you. Check these ones out on the screen now that I spotted at Sea Otter. They've got a mushroom profile, so what that means is it's got loads of ridges all the way along, and they're designed to deform, so they're very comfortable to ride. And although they are very comfortable, they're not my cup of tea because, again, that's just my preference. I prefer a grip that's got plenty of grip on texture to it, so when and if I do get sweaty hands, it's not really going to affect my riding too much. With any sort of handlebar grips, you want to be comfortable and quite neutral on the bike. You never want to be having to grip the handlebars really tight. If you get death grip, your arms are going to be more tense, more bumps and vibrations going to get transmitted, and it's going to tire you out. You want to be able to be quite flexible on the bars. A lot of riders do like really soft compound grips because they feel it has a better adhesion with the hands or the gloves that they choose. So just take that into account. Now the next point along is your handlebar sweep and how you roll them, because that makes a substantial difference to how they feel. Now a sweep, basically, or the rake, is how much curve they have in them. And you might think that a straight handlebar is what you want, but really that puts your wrists at a bit of a funny angle. If you to lay your wrists out in front of you or to hold something, you'll find that they're actually slightly offset, and the natural position for them is to hold some kind of swept back bar. So even if, like me, your bar is quite flat, you can still roll your bar forwards or backwards to get a different feel. So by loosening off a couple of stem bolts, you can actually really tune the feel of your bar and the position of your wrists on the handlebars. That can have a substantial effect on how comfortable your hands are, and again, how you feel at the end of a long ride, a rough ride. It's really important to experiment a little bit until you find your sweet spot. And when you do, just a little tip, get a bit of marker pen or a bit of tape, Tipp-Ex, anything like that, and just make a little marker that correlates to the line clamp on your stem, just so you know if you do move anything around, you can get back to that sweet spot straight away. Of course, to find your sweet spot, it does mean a bit of saddle time to find out what works and what doesn't work, but I promise you it's definitely worth experimenting with. Okay, and the other factor you need to take into account is that you've actually got your cockpit the right size for you. So of course there's different width bars, but they're not really going to affect hand pain too much. But what might actually affect it is the height of your bars, the length of your stem, and the height of your stem. Now the height of the stem is subject to moving up and down on a steerer tube and using a system of spacers either underneath or above the stem to get that in position. Height of the bars, of course, once you've got your bars, you can't change that, so you're going to need some new handlebars if you want to change that. But you will find that after a while and you do get settled, you'll know what works for you, and you can always reflect that on any new bike. On this particular bike, I've got quite a high rise handlebar, it's about 38mm rise, 30mm stem, 2 and a small spacer just under the stem there, and it's like the perfect setup for me. Now, What works for me, obviously it won't work for everyone else, and one of the things that's going to give you hand pain is if your bars are too low, you're going to have too much pressure on your hands. Now a lot of people like low bars because it makes for a very aggressive feeling bike, especially on cross-country bikes. It means that you're in a really efficient power position for riding, and also means you're going to get a lot of weight on the front wheel for traction. However, it does hamper certain riding things, and of course gives you that pressure on the outside of your hand there, so it's really crucial to make sure that it does work for you. Okay, so the next one on that list that can help alleviate hand pain is your saddle position. Now, having your saddle too far back on the rails will mean you'll have more weight on your hands on those handlebars. You'll be leaning forwards more. So if you're having to run your saddle all the way back like that, you might think that your bike might be a little bit too short for you, in which case you might want to look at potentially getting a slightly longer stem. Now you don't need to go crazy, that just could be 10 millimeters. You could also roll the bar forward slightly to help buy you a little bit more length. You should generally have your saddle around a middle sort of position against your seat post. Now there's no golden rule on this on mountain bikes because your position changes all the time when you're riding. It's not like road cycling when you're spending hours putting the power down in a very specific position. In that case, it is very crucial to get the right position. But what's more important, I think, is getting your saddle angle. If your saddle is flat in an ideal position, that is great. But if your saddle is slightly nose down at the front here, that can also put more position on your hands because you're more inclined to lean forwards on the bike. Now, some people will want to run their saddles like this, especially taller folk like myself, because you do end up with a saddle hanging so far out the frame, you actually need to counter that when you're climbing because you end up sitting too far towards the back of the bike. Now do take some time to get the correct saddle position on your bike because it does make a significant difference. Okay, so another one that you might not think of is tyre pressure. And this makes a significant difference to the way, not only how a bike handles, but the comfort you get from it. Now, I always tell people you should try and find a sweet spot with tyre pressure. You will get there. Mine tends to be in the area around 28 at the back and about 24 at the front, but it does vary immensely because of the varied conditions we have here in the UK. In the winter, I'm quite often under 20 PSI on the local trails because they're so exceptionally, the limestone and the combination of mud we have here is just, it's like riding on ice. So definitely experiment with tyre pressure. If nothing else, just your front tyre pressure if it's the hand problem you're getting, and you will find you can get a lot more comfort from the front of your bike. Now the same exact thing applies to how you set up your suspension. Now generally you should be looking for 20 to 30% of sag, and that's of the available travel on there. Now RockShox, for example, have markings on their forks to help you get to that sag point. So it's well worth taking the time to get your suspension set up correctly in the first place, but also consider your damping setups. Now I've seen people running suspension that's too soft for them and then they're using the compression dial to compensate for that. But what that means is you end up with a very harsh feeling fork despite it sitting at the correct height for you. Now that's not what you want because compression, if there's too much of it on there, it can really jar your hands and give you sort of prolonged uncomfort to your hands. So really take care of the settings on there, especially if you've got the luxury on your particular fork of having separate high and low speed compression. Now, high-speed compression is what you want to absorb those really big hits. Now, big hits can be uncomfortable, whatever. It's not those that give you the hand fatigue, it's the vibrations that you get from smaller, faster frequency hits that really make a difference. And low-speed compression damping, basically the job of it is to keep the fork up in the travel when you're cornering and putting pressure on the front of the bike, and to stop it moving around too much to the movement of you. But one thing that low-speed compression damping can do is make the fork not feel quite so supple on some of those smaller, faster, let's just call them vibrations. So if you remove a few clicks of low-speed compression damping, you can get a bit more comfort back. There is a trade-off, but there is a happy medium to be found. Another thing that often comes up that is partially to do with bike setup and partially due to rider input is the manual. Now the manual is something we all like to do, to pop that front end up and coast on down the road, down the trail or whatever it is. Now this can be difficult if you don't understand what your bike is doing, regardless of the technique that you need to do to do it. For the actual technique, there'll be a link in the description below this video of how to do the manual. That's one of our videos from over on GMBN. But for understanding the bike itself, let's just look at what happens when you do the manual. First thing obviously to understand is it's all about the balance point, in which case the fulcrum or your balance point is over the rear axle of the bike. The bike pivots at that point. So the whole point is you need to get your weight back behind that point in order to keep the bike balanced there. Now, if you've got long chainstays on your bike, you will love the fact it's really good for cornering, puts you in a neutral position on the bike, but it can make it slightly harder to manual because quite simply put, your feet are further away from your pivot point. So it makes it harder for you to lean back and get in that position. So you really must understand that. So if that's the case on your bike, then you're going to need to look at the front of your bike in order to counter that. Now, a shorter stem will help and a higher position on your cockpit will help. But of course, it's all in relation to the rest of your bike setup. The shorter your stem is, the more upright you are when you're sat in the saddle, and it puts you in a more inefficient position to ride your bike. If you have the stem slightly higher, this can have the same effect. In fact, if you look at the angle of the head angle of the bike, the higher you put the stem, the shorter it makes that top tube effectively. We might only be talking about 5 or 10 millimeters with an extreme height, but regardless, that means your top tube is shorter. It means it will manual very well, but it does mean that other things will suffer. So there's an effect to what you're doing on the bike there. Now, what I'm talking about here to get used to the bike and understand it is what the bike is doing. Any mountain bike is possible to manual technically, and you put enough hours in, you can work around these things. So even a bike with long chainstays that might feel really hard to get the front wheel up, if you persist with your technique, you will make it possible. But you can make it easier by doing little things like raising up your handlebar stem, getting a slightly higher rise bar, bring it all back towards you. That does make a difference. Now, something else that comes up from time to time is about climbing steep terrain and how it unweights the front of the bike. Now, because all of your weight is on the saddle pushing through down to the back of the bike, it's nearer a pivot point, the front end can get very light and it can be a bit of a handful for handling. So of course, you can take most control of this by getting your weight forwards and low on the bike. If you're happy to lean forwards on the front of the saddle here, you can keep that front end down without losing traction on the back of the bike. If you just stood up to lean over the front, you're taking the weight off the rear tyre, which is your power. There's a very happy medium that you have to reach to do this. And you need to find that balance in order to keep both weight on the front wheel and enough traction on the rear wheel. Now, there's a few setup points that can help you do this, and of course you need to understand as well, if your bike is too small for you, if it's just simply too short and the wheels are quite close together so the bike has a short wheelbase, it can become quite hard to climb steep terrain or even descend steep terrain on. And the reason for that is your virtual placement on the bike is going to be quite high up because of how short the bike is. And in order to keep it under control on steep terrain, whether it's down or up, you're going to have to use your body weight a lot more. It's going to be a lot more exaggerated, leaning forwards to extreme angles or leaning backwards to extreme angles. And actually being that high on the bike, you can have a bit of a pendulum effect. You can really upset the weight balance on it. Think of it as a bit like a triangle. So the ideal scenario is you want to be like an equilateral triangle with your wheels and your body weight in the middle. You know, so you're roughly situated between the two. That's the optimum sort of look you want on a bike, regardless of new geometry and fads like that. That is what you want to settle for on a bicycle. Now, next thing to consider is if your stem is too short on your bike. Now, a lot of riders these days want to have a shorter stem to make the bike more aggressive, handle a bit better on the fun downhill stuff. But you can't just plonk a short stem on any old bike, because the reason for that is you're bringing your weight nearer towards the back of the bike, which might feel nice when you're going down the steep stuff because you don't feel like you're going to get pitched over the bars. But when you're going back up that steep stuff, you need to keep your weight over the front of the bike, and actually it's going to be in the opposite place. So it's all got to be in relation to the bike size. Now, you might notice that this bike is a pretty big bike, fits me perfectly, and it's only got a 30mm stem on it. That's the correct length stem. It came with a 50 on there to start with, but I actually found that too long for all riding. The 30 is perfect for me. The next thing is your saddle position. If for any reason you're running your saddle slightly high at the front, a lot of downhill riders like to do that. It means you can access it between your legs easy. You can just pinch it between your knees. There's no reason on a bike you're pedaling up and down with a drop post to have that. You want your saddle to be flat or very slightly down at the front for comfort, good position and stuff like that. If your saddle is tilting up, your weight is going to be further to the back of the saddle, and of course what that means is you're nearly going to be doing wheelies, so you do have to take that into account. And the final one that affects that is your suspension setting, especially out back on the bike. Now, generally you should be running the same sag front and rear to keep your bike as balanced in all trail situations as possible. But some riders, especially those that fancy the gravity stuff, do often like to run a little bit more sag out back than they do out front. The reason for that is to keep the front up and a bit more supportive when they're hitting those turns and get the maximum out of the back. Of course, when you're climbing, it flips the other way. However, you might be lucky enough to have a bike that has some kind of lockout or compression dial or switch on there. Make use of that when you're climbing, because what that will do will make your bike sit higher. And of course, a bike with a back end that sits higher will climb better. Now, finding a saddle uncomfortable is one of the biggest problems with any sort of bikes, especially road bikes actually, but on a mountain bike, you do get people that suffer with getting the right saddle. Now, after years of riding, I generally know if a saddle is going to work for me. Of course, there are going to be some exceptions, but before you start considering that your saddle might not be the right one for you, have a look at your position of your saddle. Now, the first thing you need to get right is the angle of that saddle. You're looking for something that's fairly flat, maybe a tiny bit pointing down at the front on a mountain bike. The reason for that is you ride a lot of steep climbs. You want to be able to get on the front of the saddle when you need to, again, off the back of the saddle. Now, what you're aiming for is to make sure your sit bones are on the correct place on the saddle to support your body weight. That's what they're there for. And there's going to be no undue pressure on your undercarriage. So obviously, if you're going to have pressure there, it's going to give you discomfort. Now, something else that can also affect this is your saddle height. If your saddle is too high, then simply you're just going to be rocking on your hips and there's going to be a lot of weight on your undercarriage. It's never going to be comfortable. So get the setup right first. Experiment with a few things. Even a saddle fore and aft can make a difference. Give that a try. Of course, clothing makes a big difference, whether you use chamois cream or not, whether you have a chamois insert with sort of padding on your shorts or not, that makes a massive difference. Then if you're still having problems, then maybe you need to take a look at some different saddles. Now, it's a minefield out there, but you can narrow it down a little bit by thinking about the type of body that you have, because it's very likely you're going to need one of 3 types of saddle. So the mesomorph is average height and build. Nothing fancy, what most people are. Then there's the ectomorph, which is a bit more like myself, a bit tall and skinny. I mean, I'm obviously in the region of 6'4", not a lot of me. And because of that, tend to need thinner saddles. And then of course there's endomorph, which is a bit more stocky and a bit more muscular, maybe a slightly wider chassis if you want. Now, a lot of saddle manufacturers will give you advice on the website about what sort of saddle you need for your build based on those facts. Now, Ergon, for example, have a little calculator on their site, and you tell them your sit bone width, which is an easy thing for you to identify, and the type of riding you do, how frequently you ride, how long you ride for, and it can make recommendations based on that. It's a really useful tool, so I definitely recommend checking that out. Okay, and the final thing is about becoming uncomfortable when you're doing a long ride. So what I mean by that is your legs and your feet. Now, obviously the first one is your saddle height and position. Once you've got your saddle position dialed, which hopefully you have, having seen all the other stuff that's been in this video so far, you need to think about your saddle height. If your saddle height is too low, then your legs are simply going to be working too hard. On a mountain bike, you put a hell of a lot of torque through those legs, so much power on those dynamic moves to get up steep stuff, that if your saddle isn't at the correct height for really efficient riding, you're just not getting the maximum out of your legs and they're going to become fatigued sooner. It's also not that good on your knees if you're running a saddle too low in the long term, so it's definitely something you want to address. The next up is if you use any sort of clipless pedals, if you have the cleat in the correct position. So it's advisable to start with to get the cleat set up at the ball of your foot, and the ball of your foot should correlate to the center axle part of the pedal. It's arguably the most efficient starting point to find. You might find you end up wanting to go slightly further forwards or backwards for a position from a preference point of view. But that is the best point for just getting power to the pedal and supporting your foot correctly. But something else to factor in is the cleat side to side, how much float your cleat has. If your pedal mechanism has adjustable tension on it, for example, the Crank Brothers one doesn't. It's reliant on you picking the cleats whichever way around to get 15 or 20 degrees or even 10 like the new cleats we saw at Eurobike. But on Shimano pedals, for example, and other brands that are available out there, like HT, they have adjustable tension on the jaws. The reason for that is the pedals have less float to start with. That is your free movement before the jaws start releasing you. And the reason you want to have that adjustable tension, of course, is to stop yourself accidentally clipping out. So a lot of riders tend to run those with very high tension. Now, if you're the sort of rider that likes to clip out a lot during a ride, you might find that actually starts giving you sore knees. And if that's the case, then you want to get on top of that quick, because that's not the ideal situation to be in. And whatever your pedal choice, if you're using any sort of clipless pedals and you get pain in your knees, stop what you're doing and reassess it, because you don't want to damage your knees. One of the best ways to get your cleats set up in the first place is to sit on a big high surface and let your legs dangle off. Let your legs dangle until they find their natural angle, and then aim the cleats straight forwards from that point of view. As you can see by the shot of Blake just sat on a log. Now, even the way that you wear your cycling shoes and the type of cycling shoes that you use will affect your feet. Now, just think about this a little bit. If you're using a very lightweight cross-country style shoe, for example, they're made of very thin, light materials or have a very stiff, aggressive sole. Excellent for power transfer, not very good for long sessions in the saddle. You're going to get a lot of fatigue to your foot, you're going to get sore feet and potentially numb feet. So this sort of shoe, just for example, has a thicker sole on it. It's better for off the bike, a bit more support. It's designed for a long session in the saddle. It's a comfortable shoe. However, it can still cause you a few problems. If the shoe is slightly tight on you, it has a very solid toe box and a heel box here, which does suggest that if you've not got them the correct size, you could get some rub there and get some pressure. You don't want to have any pressure on your feet. And in fact, on a cycling shoe like this, you actually want to have a little bit more room to wiggle your toes around, because in winter conditions, that's how your toes get numb. If you can't move them, they'll get cold. No matter how well insulated you put over the top, you know, if you're wearing like waterproof socks, etc. If you can't wriggle those toes, you're going to get cold toes. Circulation in your feet needs to happen. And it doesn't happen as in the same way as it would if you're walking, because your feet are stationary when you're riding a bike and they're not subject to any impact. Something else to take into account is they all generally have very good retention systems. On this set of Northwave shoes, you've got twin Velcro straps and you've got a ratchet on here. Now the ratchet is easy to tighten up securely, but some people go over the top on these ones, and actually you find you have these looser than you think most of the time. Now the lower foot straps are more just to keep your foot in the shoe. You don't need to have these too tight, and if, especially on the middle one, if it puts any excess pressure on the bridge of your foot there, then it's actually going to be very uncomfortable in the long term. This is the only one that does anything to actually clamp your foot in the shoe and give you all that power to pull up on the shoe on the pedal. So just take that into account, and of course the socks you use inside those shoes. If you're wearing thick socks, it is going to hamper your movement inside the shoe, and that will later lead to a very uncomfortable foot. So just take into account that. And likewise, if you're a flat pedal rider, if you're using, say, just a set of Vans or something like that, on a long ride, your feet are going to get fatigued, because your feet are literally, you're going to get the old monkey feet curling around the pedals because there's not enough support in the shoe. I love wearing Vans on my bikes, especially if I'm just blatting around town or going to the jumps or the BMX track. But anything more than that, then they're really not designed for that. Very comfortable, very grippy, but they're not a riding shoe. So definitely consider some dedicated riding shoes out there. So there you go. Hopefully this has helped you understand the perfect riding position on your bike and how that affects both the comfort of your bike and your technique out on the trail. For a couple more useful videos, click down here if you want to see how to perfect your shifting on the bike. That's everything about getting your shifting bang on, perfectly indexed every single time. And if you want to see all the cool stuff from Eurobike, click up here. As always, click on that round globe to subscribe to GMBN Tech. We love having you on board with us, and we want you to watch all our videos. And if you like maintaining your bike and you like GMBN Tech, give us a thumbs up.